Hi, I'm Dr. Paula Redmond, a clinical psychologist, and you're listening to the When Work Hurts podcast. On this show, I want to explore the stories behind the statistics of the mental health crisis facing healthcare professionals today, and to provide hope for a way out through compassion, connection, and creativity. Join me as I talk to inspiring clinicians and thought leaders in healthcare about their unique insights, and learn how we can support ourselves and each other when work hurts. Facing racism is unfortunately a very live and present issue for many NHS staff today. To understand more about this, I spoke with Owen Chinembiri, who is a trained occupational therapist originally from Zimbabwe and now based at the NHS Race and Health Observatory. Just as a heads up, we obviously do talk about racism and some of the upsetting impacts of this throughout the episode. I started by asking Owen about his current role.
I lead on everything digital health and data related in the Race and Health Observatory. So I'll tell you just a little bit about the Race and Health Observatory. And I think it's important to mention at this point that I'm here in a personal capacity. I'm not representing the Race and Health Observatory. So everything I'm going to be saying is what Owen thinks, not what the Race and Health Observatory thinks. In February 2020, the British Medical Journal published a special edition that was called Racism in Medicine. And in it looked at ethnic inequalities in the NHS from a workforce perspective and from a patient outcomes perspective. The key thing to note that at that point, that was before COVID had become the pandemic that we know it to be today, and that George Floyd hadn't been killed yet. So at that point, there was enough evidence to have a recommendation that the NHS needed to have an independent body that focused on tackling ethnic health inequalities. So the Race and Health Observatory was born, and then my role in there is focusing, as I said, on digital health and data.
Is racism a problem in the NHS?
I think the way I'll answer your question is, what is racism? Which I know will be sound like a cop-out. I was reading, in preparation for this, I was reading a document by Penn Candola, and I said the challenge is what people define as racism is the blatant, the obvious, getting code names. That's what people see as racism. However, the modern racism is a little bit more subtle than that. It's a little bit more innocuous. There's a research that was done which asked people from an ethnic minority background to say, what do you perceive as racism at work? And some of the answers were people reported that being ignored because of your color, being overly criticized and managed more than what would happen to someone from a different ethnicity, assumptions being made about your role or your job. I'll give you an example on that. I remember one colleague who's a doctor when he was walking around and someone immediately assumed that he was a nurse. And then it was obvious why. And they said, look, I'm dressed as a doctor. What would make you think that I'm a nurse? So those are some of the things that people define as racism. Insensitive race-related jokes and banter, people not recognizing your face, being passed over for promotion, missing out on training opportunities. And one of the big ones is patients refusing to be seen by staff from an ethnic minority background. So with those things in perspective, does racism exist in the NHS? Yes, it does, because all those things happen. We might not have people walking around the NHS calling people the N-word or something like that, but that doesn't mean there isn't racism in the NHS. It exists in more subtle ways, which are people from an ethnic minority background know. One point I'd make is these issues have been known for a long time. I think when we were preparing for this podcast, we had a discussion about it, and I told you that the oldest paper that I've read was written in 1982, and it was called Racism in Nursing. And what it found is that when they talked to black nurses and midwives, they found, this is a quotation right from the paper. They all told the same story of continual job rejections, difficulties being accepted for post-basic training, and poor promotion prospects. So this was in 1982, and that is still happening to this day.
So we know this has been around, for a long time, and that at the beginning of 2020, there was a recognition that something needed to be done about this. And you've given, a lot of examples that are, difficult to kind of hear. I'm wondering about your reflections on the last couple of years and what we've learned through COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement, that, what your thoughts are on how that's shaped things.
So what I'd say is one thing we know is when COVID started, quite early on, it became apparent that NHS staff from an ethnic minority background were being disproportionately affected. And when you look at the data now, you can see that in particular, nurses from a Filipino background and doctors from an Asian background died in much, much higher rates than all other ethnicities. And early on, when I think the first 3 doctors who died were all of an Asian background, we could clearly see what was going to happen, because there was evidence that we know that when things go wrong in the NHS, people from an ethnic minority background get to be affected significantly more. What that told me is, even though we knew it, we could feel it, I think more could have been done. We should have anticipated it. We've got enough information to tell us that we could have done something. And as COVID went on and the data became more apparent that people from an ethnic minority background, not just in the NHS but in general, were getting affected more, people were almost shocked by some of the data that was coming out. And it showed me that there seems to be like a lack of awareness of some of the ethnic inequalities that exist. So for people like me, as I've said, we knew it was going to happen. But when the data started coming out, there was almost like a shock that, why is this happening? People almost didn't understand. And then compounded by the death of George Floyd, there was almost like a mass awakening. There was almost a global epiphany that, guess what? We've got ethnic health inequalities. And as I already mentioned, these have existed for more than 40 years. And for me, that has been my lesson over the past 2 years, that these inequalities exist, but for some reason, either people willfully or unintentionally are not aware of them. So there is something that needs to be done.
Reflecting on what you were saying about what happened in COVID, and we know that, staff who were from minority ethnic backgrounds were dying in greater proportions than white staff. And I remember kind of reading about it at the time, and I think, that there was narratives around, linking that to health inequalities, that, people from minority ethnic backgrounds had more health complications and therefore were at greater risk of death from COVID. But I guess what I've learned more recently, and in particular the video you shared with me, which was really striking, of narratives of healthcare staff during that time, the evidence of people being treated very differently, of being placed at greater risk, of not being given access to appropriate PPE, which is a much more uncomfortable explanation.
Yes. So if you look at the latest NHS staff survey data, of which I'll put a link in, there are questions which specifically look at COVID. So I've got data for last year. I haven't looked at the data for this year, the most recently published data. But what we know is that according to that staff survey, people from an ethnic minority background, they were more likely to work on COVID wards, and they were more likely to be redeployed to work on COVID wards. Whether that's what directly resulted in the disproportionately being represented, I cannot say for sure. But what we do know is that that's what people say were happening, that if you're from an ethnic background, you're more likely to end up working on a COVID ward, and you're more likely to be redeployed to work on a COVID ward. And I think the impact that this has, if we talk about not just COVID, but racism in general. So if you look at it at a personal level, people start feeling disillusioned. People are unhappy, people get depressed. There's a lack of confidence, sometimes anger, and people don't believe in the system anymore. And that can have serious challenges for the system. So if you look at things such as staff retention, sickness, and then the financial cost associated with that. So that's how like racism impacts people at a personal level. People go to work and they're doing a good job and they're feeling that, oh look, I'm putting in all this effort for the system, but the system does not value me, and the system is not working. It's not working for me. It's not a good feeling to have, and the research backs that.
And I guess there's also something about the makeup of potentially of staff in services, particularly when we get to, more senior levels, not being representative of the wider staff group. So I guess if you're not able to see yourself or someone like yourself working in senior positions, I guess I'm imagining that can create a real sense of disillusionment and disengagement from the process of career progression.
We know that if you look at the workforce race equality standard data, that people from an ethnic minority background are significantly underrepresented in senior pay bands. We know that they're less likely to be appointed to a role if they get shortlisted. We know that they're more likely to be disciplined. And we know that they're significantly less likely to believe that their organization provides equal opportunities. So for me, there's three problems with that. So one is the personal one, at a personal level. So you know that I'm doing the right thing. For some reason, I'm just not getting promoted. At times, we get examples of people who talk about being frog-leaped, is that the term? Frog-leaped by people who either qualified after them, and then after a few years, they get promoted and start managing them. And like, oh, wait a minute, this person was a student a few years ago, and now they're managing me. So that happens a lot, and it can be very, very demoralizing. Then the other problem is we know that there are benefits to having a diverse leadership. So McKinsey has done a lot of work on this. What they found is, I think their most recent paper is called Diversity Wins. So once again, I'll send you the link to it. They looked at more than 1,000 companies across 12 countries, I think, in the initial research. I think the later research has looked at even more companies. The companies that were in the top quartile for gender diversity were 20% more likely to overperform. So if you're in the top quartile, so this is really important. So this is not just having one or two token women on the board. No, this is like being in the top quartile for gender diversity. You're 20% more likely to overperform. And then the companies that were in the top quartile for ethnic diversity were 33% more likely to ever overperform. So what this means is there are clear benefits to having diversity in leadership. So by not having a lot of people from an ethnic minority background in leadership positions, we are missing out on that benefit. Then the third issue that I always talk about is one of blind spots. So I'll give you one non-related example, then I'll come back to one like NHS-related example. So there's work that was done looking at the financial crash in 2009. And one of the things they found is that because of the homogeneity of the leadership in banks at that time, they had massive blind spots at what was happening on the ground. So they could not see what was coming. So a lot of if the leadership had been more diverse and they were having conversations with people outside their bubble, they might have been able to see some of those challenges earlier. Then when it comes to the NHS, I remember visiting one trust in London. And at the time, we met the staff network for staff from an ethnic minority background. And when we're talking to them about what their fears were, one of the things that they brought out is that they lived in an area which had quite, at the time, high rates of stabbings of black children. So when parents were there, were saying, look, I'm really worried that if I'm at work, if my phone rings after 3, my heart skips a beat because I'm thinking, oh, look, maybe something has happened to my son, that type of thing. So this is something they were genuinely worried about. When we met the senior leadership team of that organization, they were all white, and most of them, except one, commuted into the area, so they didn't live there. They were not even aware of these challenges that their members of staff were worried about because it was not part of who they were. So they had a massive blind spot as to something that was really, really affecting their workforce. So that's one of the challenges of having a senior leadership team that's not a representative of the workforce or the community, that unintentionally you can have these blind spots.
We've touched on different areas of identity and diversity there, but I wonder about people who have multiple minority identities, if we're thinking about intersectionality. What your observations are around that?
I think, once again, the latest data from the RES report sort of covers intersectionality. And the data is very clear that Black women in particular have got the worst experience in the NHS. They're least likely to be represented in senior positions. They report the highest rates of bullying and harassment from patients and from colleagues, and they're least likely to believe in equal opportunities. I know that some of the data actually is people from a gypsy background. We take out people from a gypsy background. If you look at ethnic minorities, Black women are the ones who are most who've got the worst experience. So I think someone calls it the multiplying effect, that for every protected characteristics you have, it means you're way, way more likely to have the least positive experience in the NHS. And then also something that I always talk about is there's something called the glass cliff. So the glass cliff, it's a research-backed phenomenon which shows that people, either women or people from an ethnic minority background or women from an ethnic minority background as well, tend to be disproportionately represented in the most challenging leadership positions. And as a result, they tend to be overly scrutinized, and they do not get recognized for the work that they do. As you know, we live in a world where people look at your CV and say, oh, look, this person used to work at this very challenged organization. And they would want to work with you. So, oh, look, we know that this organization had a history of really poor care. And as a result, I think the glass cliff talks about it becomes a rigged leadership test, as it were, that people from an ethnic minority background, women, end up working in very challenged positions, which makes it even more likely for them to succeed, or maybe the way that their success is shown is slightly different. Therefore, this compounds even the challenge they have of trying to progress. So to summarize, yes, the more protected characteristics someone has, the more difficult it is going to be for you. And I think one of the things we need to start doing is having those nuanced discussions in a way that everyone understands. That, look, if you're an ethnic minority woman, if you're someone who's disabled, and you're a woman, if you're disabled, you're from an ethnic minority background, it means that the challenges you face are actually multiplied.
So clearly, racism is bad for staff, and, we've heard how it's also bad for services and organisations as a whole. Is there any data around the impact on patients and patient care?
Actually, there is. And when Sir Robert Francis was looking at some of the failures at Mid Staffordshire, looking at whistleblowing and the freedom to speak up work they did there. What they discovered is that ethnic minority staff were more likely to be victimized if they spoke up about poor care. They were less likely to be praised if they spoke up about poor care. And as a result, they were almost half as likely to speak up about poor care because they were afraid that they'll be victimized or they wouldn't be praised. And that's not something you want. You want to be able to know that everyone working in the NHS feels empowered to speak up and to whistleblow when they see poor care. There's also work that was done by Professor Dawson and Professor West, where they were looking at staff survey and patient survey results and trying to see what the correlations were. So what they found is that things such as high work pressure for staff, perceptions of equal treatment, and discrimination for staff were all very damaging to patient satisfaction. And as already discussed, two of the areas where ethnic minority staff with the worst experience is equal opportunities and discrimination. And in that paper, I think the summary, almost like one of the things that they concluded was that the way an organization treats its ethnic minority staff is almost a barometer. Actually, they described it as a good barometer of how well patients are likely to feel cared for in that organization. So organizations with high levels of discrimination against the ethnic minority staff, when you talk to patients in that organization, they don't feel as cared for compared to other organizations. And then the last point I'll make around this is we talked about one of the ways that people perceive racism in the NHS is patients refusing to be treated by someone from an ethnic minority background. What this can do is that patients might actually miss out on being seen by the best clinician. It could be that on that day, the most senior, most experienced, most knowledgeable clinician could be someone from an ethnic minority background. And if patients, for racist reasons, feel I don't want to be seen by someone from an ethnic minority background, they might be missing out on being treated by the best person. So these are some of the impacts that racism can have on patient care.
So, bad for obviously the individual staff members affected, bad for organisations and bad for patients. Assuming we can all agree that we don't want an NHS that tolerates racism, and hearing the data, it's very clear, very stark. Why do you think it is that it's so persistent, so pervasive, so difficult to tackle effectively?
Professor Williams from Harvard, who's probably known as the world leader in ethnic health inequalities, talks about the three barriers to tackling health inequalities, which are political will, empathy gap, and resources. So if we look at each one of those so political will is just about like the leadership in an organization accepting that this is a significant problem that needs to be dealt with. And this will mean leading from the front, making sure that everyone in the organization recognizes ethnic inequalities, be it for patients or for staff, as a problem that everyone has to be involved in. That has not always been the case. And I think in some cases, it continues to be a challenge. I think there's still people who in senior positions who do not believe that there's ethnic inequalities in the NHS. There are people who genuinely believe that racism isn't there anymore. I think we've touched on it, that their definition of racism maybe does not capture the modern way that racism presents itself. So political will has been a big challenge. Then the other issue is the empathy gap. One of the challenges around the empathy gap is at times relates to the example I gave about if you've got leaders who are not representative of their workforce. So if the challenges that other people are going through are not a part of your reality, you won't have the empathy. Therefore, you won't feel like it's something that you need to tackle. So the thing with the political will and empathy gap, they go hand in hand. If the leaders or if anyone does not feel this is a problem, then it's going to result in problem number 3. They are not going to put in the right resources to tackle the problem. One of the most successful programs in tackling ethnic inequalities was at a university in America. I'll look for the name and then I'll send you the link to the study. So they dedicated 1% of their budget to say, look, we're going to tackle inequality in our university. And they made sure that everyone at every level was aware of the challenges and that they all had a part to play. If we look at what happens in the NHS, most organizations will have someone who's called an equality and diversity manager. Sometimes it's a head of equalities. They tend to be mostly around agenda for change band 7 and band 8A. So they're sort of like middle managers, but they're not the most senior people in the NHS. And they're then each organization will have like one person looking not just at the workforce, but at staff, not just at workforce inequalities, but at patient inequalities as well. And that's just not enough resources. So that has been one of the biggest challenges, that there's not been enough resources that have been made available to tackle this problem. So what the death of George Floyd and COVID have done is actually there's now been a lot of investment in the area of inequalities in general and ethnic inequalities specifically. What I hope is that investment is going to stay, but we're already starting to see that some of that investment was for a limited period of time. Some of that investment sort of was tied to COVID, and as we overcome COVID, some of that investment is being pulled. So for us to really make a big difference in this, we need the investment and the resources to be there, and that's not what's been done. Then another challenge as to why things haven't changed is the constantly changing of initiatives. So there's a lot of acronyms I can just be telling about. Oh, there was something called EDS2, then you had EDS1, then you had the RARES, then you got this. The NHS is constantly changing the initiatives around tackling inequalities and ethnic inequality specifically. The problem is, I'll quote what one of the most senior EDI managers in the NHS said. He said, if this was easy, we'd have tackled it a long time ago. This is not something that's going to be tackled in 3-4 years. But what the NHS does is specifically around inequalities, probably more than anything else. After 3 years, they'll have a look and say, this is not working, let's try something else. And in try something else, it means you now have to set up new systems, reorientate everyone, get the buy-in. And once that thing is starting to just develop a bit of momentum, people look and say, oh, look, it's 4 years, it doesn't work. Let's move on to something else. So that's been one big barrier as well. And then aligned to that is just the high turnover rate you get for people working in inequalities in general and ethnic inequality specifically, because it's a tough job to do. People get burnt out really quickly, and then people move on and go do something else. And as with every job in every walk in life, when someone new comes in, they want to put their stamp on it, as it were. So when you get someone new, they start changing things again. But new people come in with new ideas, then it's almost like everything that's been done before almost gets forgotten, then they start again. It's almost like starting from zero. So that's one of the reasons as well why things haven't changed as quickly as they should have or they should be.
I was thinking as you were talking, Owen, about how, given the context of the NHS in terms of the load that people are carrying generally, the stretched resources, the emotional demands of the work, that, there's a lot of exhaustion around. And I think, there's a danger sometimes with this work being, siloed into a particular little part. Everyone has to do some mandatory training and that's almost it. Or, maybe a bi-monthly committee meeting. And that's really hard to sustain, this real kind of, culture change when people are stretched. And I guess we end up seeing not always the good sides of organisations and systems and people when things are hard.
Yeah, so there's an overly used phrase in the NHS, which is like the golden thread that runs through everything. And my view is if equalities and including ethnic inequalities was the golden thread that ran through everything, that would definitely lessen the load on the equality and diversity managers. The example I always give is like budget management. So in the NHS, regardless of what role you do or how senior, if you've got budget responsibilities, you are expected to work within your budget. If you don't know how to budget, you have to go and learn. But you'll be told that, look, you're going to deliver this service for £100,000, whatever it is, and that's it. And you have to be able to manage that budget. And I almost feel that inequalities has to be treated in the same way, that everyone has to be told that, look, as part and parcel of your role, we want everyone working with you, under you, to have the same positive experience regardless of their background. We want every patient that you treat, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, to have the same positive experience. And for me, if we get to that point where that is the default position, that people see equality as part and parcel of their everyday job, we'll start to see the improvements that we want to see.
Owen, have you got any examples for us of initiatives that you've come across that have been effective in producing change?
Yeah, so I'll give you two examples. So one is there's an organization called North East London Foundation Trust. And when I was working for the NHS England Workforce Race Equality Standard team, I used to be the lead analyst there. So that organization went through 3 years of continuous improvement when you looked at their workforce data. So this is looking at the levels of discrimination, looking at belief in equal opportunities, and looking at career progression. So for those 3 years, you had people from an ethnic minority background getting promoted and feeling better about working in the organization. So then the question becomes, what do they do? So the first thing that they did is they came up with their strategy, which I think is still available online. I think it was their 2020 strategy at the time. They've since updated it. And that strategy was signed off at every level in the organization. So they made sure that every team in the organization was aware of that strategy, and then they signed up to say, yeah, you know what, as a team, we sign up to this strategy. So this wasn't just something which the equality and diversity manager was doing. This was something which the whole organization was doing. Then the other thing that they did as well is that in that strategy, every board member had to sign up to it as well. So this wasn't just something which is going to be done by the chief people officer, but every board member was aware that, look, I have a role to play in this as well. And then importantly, the organization, I think it touches on about what I said before, they just didn't start off and stop. They were actually working on this for a long period of time before they started seeing those 3 years of year-on-year improvements, which I think is really, really, really important for people to understand that this wasn't like a 1 year, 2 years, oh, let's try this. No. They actually went for like 2-3 years before they started seeing those year-on-year improvements. And then most importantly for that organization at the time, their CEO was a gentleman called John Browder. And what John Browder used to do is in the NHS, when you've got new members of staff starting, you have this induction. So it's like a day where you go and you're told about the organization strategy, you do your information governance training and everything else. So John, as the CEO, would go to that induction. And then he would tell people clearly that, look, for this organization, we're here to provide excellent clinical care. And one of our key priorities is tackling ethnic inequalities. And you make clear that as you walk into this organization, I don't care what job you're doing, those two things are really important, and you are going to play a part in it. So it sets the tone for someone getting into the organization. So you already know that, look, I'm coming to an organization where ethnic inequalities are not tolerated. So that's probably, I think, one of the most successful organizations or initiative around tackling ethnic inequalities in the NHS that I've come across here.
So what you've described, how, the strategy is really embedded, from top to bottom, and as you said, kind of setting the tone, a real kind of cultural message of priority. I'm curious about whether there are particular, strategic measures within the strategy that were particularly helpful and important, or whether you think kind of just setting the tone and the embedding of it was key.
One of the things that they did was, because it was embedded everywhere, they had the governance behind it as well. So one of the things they did around recruitment was having a diverse interview panel. So you will find that I think now it's like the token thing every organization say they do. That, oh, look, you know what, we'll just get someone with a bit of melanin on the interview panel, then everything's okay. Let's just get a woman on the interview panel, then everything's okay. But what they did is they said, look, they put governance in place. One was the people who were supposed to be on the interview panel were trained to say, right, this is what a fair interview looks like. So your role there is beyond just representing people from an ethnic background. Your role is there in part as an advisor and as I don't want to use the word referee, but as someone who understands how a fair process looks like. And that person was also given the authority to say, if you feel or you see something in that interview that doesn't feel right, you escalate it. So that's extra governance. So we've got examples of this happening in other organizations where they say, oh, come on, let's just get an Owen on the panel. And then you get there and it's quite clear that the scoring doesn't work, or there's a preferred candidate. But in that organization, the governance to say, right, this is not just about doing it, this is about making sure that we do it and we do it right. So it's not only having the strategy, it's having the governance in place as well and implementing it fully.
Was there a second example, Owen, of?
Yeah, so the second example I'm going to give is, I won't name the organization, but I'll tell you what happened. So they were recruiting a new team, and then we were called to come and say, oh, look, can you check whether this is a fair process or not? So the first thing we asked for was the demographics of the people who had been shortlisted. And it was quite apparent that for one of the roles, they'd only listed men. For some of the roles, there was no one from an ethnic minority background at all. So generally, it was quite clear that with the shortlisting that had been done, they're not going to get the outcome that they wanted. So what then happened is they went back and said, okay, this is not going to work. So they stopped the interview process there and there, which is really important. So it's about showing that leadership that as soon as people could see that we're not going to get the outcomes that they want, they were brave enough to say we're going to stop things. Whereas normally people just say, okay, no, let's do it and then do it as lessons learned later. So they then changed the interview process completely. So instead of shortlisting, they went for something called long listing. So what that does is it removes some of the biases that happens at shortlisting. And they also went for something called batch recruitment, where you don't interview for one job at a time, you interview for multiple jobs at the same time. And then they also had diverse interview panels. So each interview panel had to be diverse. And then they also did something called blind auditioning. So the way blind auditioning works is, so let's say it's you and me, Paula, we're interviewing for a producer for a podcast. And all we get is we're just told that the person you're going to interview has got the qualifications for the job. So you don't know their name, you know nothing about them. So the first time, the only interaction you have with that person is when they walk into the room. So you don't have any preconceived ideas. And by making those changes in the recruitment process, what happened is that in that organization, they ended up appointing, I think more than 60% of the people appointed into senior positions were female. And I think about 40% were people from an ethnic minority background. So by showing good leadership, strong leadership, changing the processes, getting the right things in place, they're able to achieve what they wanted.
I read recently in the BMJ, we're looking into the inequalities for referrals around complaints to the GMC, the General Medical Council. And there was, a kind of known disparity in that more people from Black and minority ethnic groups were going through to complaint level than white people, doctors. And they changed the process so that those applications were anonymous. And the impact of that was that the racial disparities disappeared. So something as, I guess, straightforward as anonymizing those applications was able to remove the bias inherent in the process.
Yes, yeah. I think it's something which happens all the time, and it's not just around ethnicity as well. So obviously, we've got the usual examples where people send the same CV with different names and you get different outcomes. And you got examples of like when people used to audition to be in an orchestra, that when people would hear the footsteps, oh look, this person is wearing heels, immediately they'd score them differently. But when they started having people walking in barefoot, they saw that actually the number of women who started getting in were much higher because they had no idea. So we know that there are inherent biases. What I would say is what needs to be done is exactly what was done in this case, where you anonymize it and you always look at the outcome, say, right, what can we do to get the outcome that we want? And where in our process are they most likely to be biased? And in most cases, you get the bias where people are able to distinguish between people of different characteristics. I remember in 2010, 11, the NHS runs its graduate management scheme. And at that time, people from an ethnic minority background were significantly underrepresented. So what they did is they worked with a company that understood some of the biases. So what they did is they said, right, remove photos and names from all applications. They started having more like online tests for some of the things to say, right, you just get in there and then you enter your responses. You've just got a number. So you're candidate 1, candidate 2. And by making those changes and removing any points where people will be able to identify who you are, your characteristics, they actually saw that for the next cohort, the proportion of people from an ethnic minority background was representative of the applications. So it's something that I very much support, that if you got review all your processes, identify where the inequalities are, where you might be swayed one way or the other by someone's characteristics, and try to resolve that.
And I guess what feels challenging about that is owning and accepting an innate bias that as a white person, if I'm on a panel, I'm likely to, whatever my conscious mind might want to convince me of, I'm likely to favour someone with a white sounding name. And that's not a nice thing to have to accept about myself. And I guess I'm wondering if that is part of the barrier too, that in order to make these changes, we have to accept, we have to name it, that we do hold biases, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we do not have conversations enough about is exactly that, to say, look, we all have biases, and we know that people from certain backgrounds disproportionately affected by those biases. And part and parcel of what we need to do to tackle the inequalities is to have more of those conversations to get people to understand that this is not about someone accusing you of being a racist or something. This is about saying, look, there's something in our systems that result in people from an ethnic minority background having worse experiences and less opportunities, and then trying to identify what those challenges are and working together to tackle them. And part of that conversation is about acknowledging that there are biases in our systems, be it at an individual or at a systematic level. There are biases that are inherent in how we do things, and it's about how do we work through them in a way that benefits everyone. And part of it is, like you said, accepting that, look, we all have biases, and as long as we know what those biases are, how they affect us, and mitigate against them.
So what would you say to people listening to this about what we might be able to do on an individual level to tackle this? So
there are three things I'd say people need to do. So the first thing is to look at the data for your organization, if it exists at all. So whether you're a psychologist like yourself, whether you're an occupational therapist, whether you're a nurse, just look at the data and say, in your organization, what's the career progression like? Where do people sit in leadership? Is it representative of the workforce? Is it representative of your patient groups? If you're not collecting that data yet, then challenge people to say, oh, look, we need to start collecting the data and analyzing it that way. Take a look at, like, just going to say a psychologist because you're here with me. Look at your patient group, right? Are there any patients who either have got a higher dropout rate by ethnicity? What's the proportion of patients who we refer on to something else or something? Just look at the data and see what it tells you. So that alone is the first thing you need to do. Look at the data for your organization, for workforce, and for patients, or if you don't work in healthcare, for your clients, because this could be a business opportunity. If you're a business that caters only to people of certain ethnicities, there's a whole group of other ethnicities who you might be missing out on. And then the second thing is to have conversations in your organization about ethnic inequalities. So when I'm doing presentations, there's a video I normally play, which is of the South African rugby team, the Springboks. I'm a big rugby fan. Go Springboks. Apologize to my...
No apologies needed, Owen. I'm with you.
Apologies to our English listeners here. So what it is, once again, we'll put in the link to the video below, so you can jump to about 8 minutes. So one of the things that Rassi did when he took over the Springboks is that at the time, there was a push to have more diversity in South African rugby. And there was always the pushback that you're lowering the standard. You want just to have tokenism. But he doubled down. He didn't. You actually said, you know what? Actually, no. I want the team to be representative of the nation. So instead of pushing back, I just said you're going to do it. And within the team itself, he realized that people didn't understand the issues around race. So in the same team, you have someone like Mapimbi, who came from some of the worst deprivation ever. And then you've got other players who came from significant wealth, and they're playing the same team, and they didn't understand what that is. So what he did is, at the start, he made them sit in a room, depending on where you're from, for hours to talk about the issues, to say, right, you need to understand where everyone is coming from. You need to have the conversations about ethnic inequalities. You need to understand why people are clamoring to have more black players, to have more players who look like them in the Springboks. And by doing that, it actually brought the team closer, because they now understood each other together. They're now able to work together with purpose. And against all odds, they went on to win the World Cup in 2019. Right. And then the last thing I'd say is go out and read books. So there are a lot of books that are available there on issues around ethnic inequalities. I've read quite a few, and what I've discovered is the most well-known books, without naming them, are not the ones I enjoyed the most. So I'm someone who's got a data background, research, evidence. The one that I enjoyed the most was one called Diversify by June Sapong, because it's actually like research-based. So she actually do research, lots of data, a lot of articles saying this is what this says. So for me, that's the one that resonated with me the most. There are other ones which people tell of a personal story to say this is what I went through. So it's not research or evidence, it's just someone telling this is what I went through. And there are other people who find that more appealing. So what I would say is go look for a book around there. There are so many of them, and look for one that will resonate with you, and then just read it. And then the last one is support those who are trying to make a difference. So as mentioned before, these are not, the jobs look more glamorous on Twitter than they do in real life. They're very challenging jobs. And if you've got someone in your team, in your organization, who's doing something on tackling inequalities or specifically ethnic inequalities, when you see them, just give them a pat on the back and ask them, how can I help, and find a way to work with them to make a positive difference.
And I wonder if I could ask you what kind of sustains you, what nurtures you, what keeps you going in doing the hard work that you do?
Oh, okay. Right. So one of the things is I run a lot. So I exercise, so that I call it my mental exorcism. So like at the end of a hard day or something, if I want to clear my mind, I go for a run. But the other really important thing, which I'll say to everyone listening on the podcast, is have a good network. Have someone that you can talk to. I'm blessed to have some friends and some role models and people I look up to. People like my boss Habib, Yvonne Coghill. I'm part of a group of Zimbabweans who call ourselves Progressive Minds. We catch up every fortnight just to have a chat, just to, we call it debrief, and to learn. So look, this is what's happened. So that's really, really important. That's what sustains me, knowing that I've got all these people out there. And also importantly, I know that some of the work I'm doing is making a difference. Maybe not at a national system level, but on the odd occasion, someone will call you and say, oh, look, you know what, Owen, because of this work that you did, this is how I personally benefited from it. Thank you. And that always makes it so much worthwhile. Say, okay, look, maybe we haven't got rid of all the inequalities in the NHS, but I managed to get rid of the inequalities for that one person, and that one person's life is much better. It always makes such a big difference.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please do share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. I'd love to connect with you, so do come and find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. You can also sign up to my mailing list to keep up to date with future episodes and get useful psychology advice and tips straight to your inbox. All the links are in the show notes. Thanks again, and until next time, take good care.